They thought it was eternal, the quiet harvesting. Not of bodies, no, that would be too obvious, but of spirit, of will, of that fragile, flickering thing inside people that whispers, maybe I can be more. For years, they fed on silence, on fear dressed up as obedience, on dreams buried so deep, even their owners forgot where they left them. Smiles were worn like masks, and nobody questioned who was pulling the strings behind them, because it was easier that way. Wasn't it easier to kneel than to stand, easier to follow than to think, easier to slowly disappear than to risk being seen? And then something went wrong. You showed up not louder than the rest, not stronger, not chosen, just unwilling to break, unwilling to let them carve pieces out of your soul and call it normal. And that's the funny thing about systems built on quiet suffering. They don't collapse when everyone fights back. They collapses when just one person refuses to be harvested. They never refuses to be harvested. They never need a change. That's the illusion. People imagine control as something loud, something violent, something you can point at and say, there it is. But this was quieter, cleaner. It slipped in without permission and made itself at home inside people's thoughts. It didn't take bodies. It took something far more valuable. The part that resists, the part that dreams, the part that questions why things are the way they are. It started small. A doubt here, a fear there, a voice that didn't belong to you, but sounded just familiar enough that you trusted it. Stay in line. Don't speak too much. Don't stand out. And people listened, not because they were weak, but because it felt safe. Safety is a powerful drug. It convinces you that shrinking is survival, that silence is strength, that losing pieces of yourself is just the cost of fitting in. And so the harvesting began not in fields, not with tools you can see, but in classrooms where curiosity was quietly replaced with compliance, in workplaces where passion was traded for permission, in homes where dreams were laughed at until they sounded ridiculous even to the dreamer. Bit by bit, people gave away parts of themselves, not realizing they were feeding something that thrived on their surrender. It was almost elegant, no screams, no resistance, just a slow, steady draining of identity. People woke up one day and couldn't recognize the person staring back at them, but they couldn't explain why. They had done everything right, followed every rule, stayed exactly where they were told to stay, and yet something was missing. Something essential had been taken, and no one could tell them when it happened. That's the brilliance of it. When theft feels like routine, no one reports it. When loss feels like normal, no one questions it. They kept people busy chasing approval, measuring their worth through the eyes of others, comparing, competing, exhausting themselves just to feel like they belonged somewhere. And while everyone was distracted, the real extraction continued beneath the surface. Hope became smaller. Voices became quieter. Fire turned into ash. People started policing themselves. That's when you know the system is working perfectly. No need for force when people enforce their own limitations. No need for cages when the mind builds its own walls. They called it discipline. They called it maturity. They called it growing up, but it was none of those things. It was subtraction disguised as progress. And the scariest part, most people never even realized they were being harvested. Fear was never introduced as fear. That would have been too obvious, too easy to reject. It arrived wearing something respectable, something people could justify. It called itself normal. It blended into routines, into expectations, into the quiet agreements people make with the world just to avoid standing out. Nobody questions normal, because normal feels safe, and safety feels right. It started shaping behavior long before anyone realized it had a name. The hesitation before speaking up. The second, guessing before making a move. The instinct to shrink in rooms where confidence should have lived. It didn't feel like fear. It felt like being careful, responsible. Smart, that's how it survives. It convinces you that playing small is wisdom, that holding back is intelligence, that silence is a sign of control. It whispers that risks are dangerous, that attention is risky, that being seen comes with consequences you're not ready to face. And slowly, that whisper becomes a rule you follow without thinking. People begin to edit themselves. They choose words that won't offend, ideas that won't challenge, paths that have already been approved by someone else. They stop asking what they want and start asking what is acceptable. And every time they choose acceptable over authentic, something shifts inside them, something subtle but permanent. The world applauds it too. That's the twisted part. You get rewarded for hiding, praised for being sensible, encouraged to stay within limits that were never designed for you. You hear things like be realistic, don't aim too high, know your place. And it sounds like guidance, like concern, like people trying to protect you. Protection from what? From failure, from judgment, from stepping outside the script that everyone else is following without question. Doesn't it push you back? When it can convince you to stay still on your own, it becomes a filter through. A filter, which everything is measured. Opportunities look like threats. Growth feels like danger. Even your own potential starts to look suspicious, like something that might expose you instead of elevate you. And so you retreat, not because you lack strength, but because you've been trained to associate courage with risk, with loss over time. It rewires identity. You don't say, I'm afraid. You say, that's just not me. You don't admit you're holding back. You claim you're being practical. Fear doesn't just influence decisions. It redefines who you believe you are. It builds a version of you that fits perfectly inside its boundaries. And everyone around you reinforces it because they're doing the same thing. They've accepted the same limits, followed the same unwritten rules, convinced themselves that this is how life is supposed to be. So, when someone starts to step out, starts to question, starts to move differently, it makes them uncomfortable. Not because it's wrong, but because it exposes something they've buried. So they pull you back not with force, but with advice, not with threats, but with concern, not with control, but with the illusion of care. And just like that, fear keeps wearing its mask, looking ordinary, sounding reasonable, feeling like the only way to survive, while quietly making sure no one ever truly lives. It was never announced as a rule. No one gathered in a room and declared that individuality had to be traded for obedience. It just settled in like dust, invisible at first, then everywhere. People didn't notice the shift because it didn't demand anything all at once. It asked for small adjustments, tiny compromises, just enough to keep things smooth, to keep things predictable, Follow the line, stay in place, do what works. It sounded reasonable. It always does. Individuality is messy. It questions things, disrupts patterns, refuses to fit neatly into expectations. Obedience, on the other hand, is clean, efficient, easy to manage. It creates order, and people are taught to value order above all else. So when the two stood side by side, the choice was quietly made long before anyone realized there was even a choice to begin with. People started sanding down their edges, the parts that made them different, the thoughts that didn't match the crowd, the instincts that pushed them in directions no one else seemed to understand. Those became inconvenient, difficult, risky, so they were softened, reshaped, or buried entirely, not because they had no value, but because they didn't fit the structure that had been built around them. And the structure rewarded obedience every time. You follow instructions. You get approval, you repeat what's expected. You get recognition, you stay within boundaries. You get accepted. It becomes a system of quiet conditioning, not enforced through punishment as much as reinforced through validation. People learn quickly what gets them ahead and what gets them ignored. And once that pattern locks in, they stop exploring who they are and start perfecting who they're supposed to be. That's where the trade happens, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, and instead of stand out every time a unique idea is held back, because it might sound strange every time a person adds their own voice just to echo someone else's. Something is exchanging originality for approval, authenticity for security, freedom for belonging, and the strength part is people. Talent to take quietness, to take belonging, goal. Person on one force, fun, discipline. They call it professionalism. They call it maturity. They wear their obedience like a badge, proof that they understand how the world works. And maybe they do. Maybe they understand it so well that they stop trying to change it altogether. That's when individuality begins to look like rebellion, not because it's wrong, but because it refuses to comply. A person who thinks differently becomes a problem. A person who speaks differently becomes a risk. A person who acts differently becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing obedience cannot tolerate. So the system tightens, not with force, but with expectation. Stay consistent, stay agreeable, stay within the lines. People begin to monitor themselves before anyone else has to. They catch their own thoughts, filter their own words, adjust their own behavior. It becomes automatic, a reflex. They don't even realize they're doing it anymore. And slowly, the idea of being fully yourself starts to feel uncomfortable, unfamiliar, unsafe, unnecessary, because everything around you is designed to reward sameness and discourage difference. So obedience rises, quietly taking the place of individuality, not by destroying it outright, but by convincing people they never needed it in the first place. Refusal doesn't arrive with noise. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for attention, doesn't need approval. It begins in a place so small most people overlook it. A single thought that doesn't fall in line. A quiet, no where there used to be automatic agreement. It doesn't look like strength at first. It looks like hesitation, like uncertainty, like something out of place. Because obedience had become instinct, say, yes, go along, don't question. And then something interrupts that pattern, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to create friction where there used to be flow. A moment where the script no longer fits, where the words feel to cease in your mouth, where the role you've been playing starts to feel like a costume you can't keep wearing. That's where refusal takes its first breath. It's uncomfortable. It pulls you out of rhythm, makes you aware of things you were never supposed to notice. The expectations, the invisible boundaries, the quiet pressure to remain exactly who you've been shaped to be. Refusal doesn't erase those things. It exposes them, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. That's the problem. Because awareness doesn't let you go back to sleep. You start catching the moments where you would have agreed with Awaken. You notice the times you shrink, just feel the weight every compromise you once ignored. And suddenly, saying yes becomes heavier than saying no. But refusal isn't easy. It comes with consequences the system never had to enforce before, because most people never reach this point. The moment you stop cooperating, even in small ways, the world around you shifts. People notice. Not always directly, not always openly, but the energy changes. You're harder to predict, harder to manage, harder to fit into the spaces that once held you perfectly. And that makes people uncomfortable, not because you're wrong, but because you're different. They start asking questions, offering advice, reminding you of how things are supposed to be done. It sounds reasonable. It sounds helpful. But underneath it, there's something else. A quiet attempt to pull you back into alignment. To restore the version of you they understand, because refusal breaks patterns. It disrupts expectations. It challenges routines. It introduces uncertainty into systems that depend on consistency. And systems don't like uncertainty. So they push back, not with force. Not with force. But with pressure, not with threats. But with doubt, not with control. But with subtle reminders of what you risk losing: approval, acceptance, belonging. Refusal asks you to weigh those things against something far less tangible, but far more important to most people's self. And that's where most people stop, because it's easier to return into what's familiar than to keep walking into something unknown. But for those who don't turn back, turn back, something begins to change. Refusal stops feeling like resistance and starts feeling like clarity, like choosing your own thoughts instead of inheriting them, like speaking words that actually belong to you, like standing in a space that isn't defined by someone else's expectations. It doesn't make life simpler. It makes simpler. It makes it real. And once that shift happens, once a shift happens, obedience no longer feels natural. It feels forced, like something you outgrew but were never meant to leave. And refusal just keeps growing louder without making a sound. Control was never meant to be noticed. That was its strength. It moved beneath everything, shaping outcomes without revealing its presence. People believed they were making choices, believed they were moving freely, believed they were deciding their own direction. And maybe they were, just within limits they never saw. Because real control doesn't stop you. It guides you. It builds invisible walls and lets you walk inside them, convincing you the space is endless, while quietly determining how far you'll ever go. It doesn't silence you. It teaches you what not to say. It doesn't block your path. It shows you the right ones to take, and for a long time, it worked perfectly. People stayed predictable, patterns stayed intact, nothing moved unless it was supposed to. Then something shifted, not everywhere. Not all at once, just in one place where the pattern didn't hold. A single interruption. A break in rhythm. The kind of disruption that doesn't look like much from the outside, but changes everything underneath, because control depends on consistency. It needs repetition. It needs obedience. It needs people to follow the same scripts without deviation. Take that away, even slightly, and the system begins to falter. Disruption doesn't need to be loud. It can be a question that wasn't asked before a decision that doesn't match expectations. A step taken in a direction no one accounted for, and suddenly, the structure has to respond. That's when cracks appear, not visible ones. Not at first, but fractures in the way things function. The smooth flow starts to stumble. The predictability begins to slip. Control loses its grip, not because it's weak, but because it was never designed to handle unpredictability. It was designed to manage patterns, not break them, and disruption creates something dangerous, uncertainty. Once uncertainty enters the system, everything becomes harder to maintain. The rules don't apply as cleanly. The outcomes aren't as guaranteed. The responses have to change, adapt, react instead of dictate. That's where control starts to lose its advantage. Because reacting means it's no longer in charge. It starts watching more closely, tightening its influence, trying to correct the shift. But the more it reacts, the more it reveals itself. The invisible becomes noticeable. The guidance starts to feel like pressure. The structure begins to feel like a cage, and once people feel that, something inside them changes. They start questioning, why does this path feel forced? Why does this choice feel limited? Why does this system feel so dependent on me staying exactly where I am? Disruption spreads like that, not through force, but through awareness. One person steps outside the pattern, and suddenly others see that it's possible, that the lines aren't fixed, that the structure isn't as solid as it pretends to be, and every new deviation adds pressure to a system that depends on uniformity. Control doesn't collapse instantly. It resists, it adjusts. It tries to re-establish order, but it's no longer operating in silence. That changes everything, because once disruption begins, control can no longer rely on invisibility. It has to defend itself, and in doing so, it starts to lose the very thing that made it powerful in the first place. They always feared numbers, movements, crowds rising all at once, loud enough to shake foundations. That's what they prepared for. That's what they built defenses against. 1,000 voices, 1,000,000 hands, something big enough to be seen coming from a distance. But they misunderstood something simple. Power doesn't always arrive in numbers. Sometimes it walks in alone, quiet, unnoticed, uninvited, just one person who doesn't follow the pattern the way everyone else does. One person who doesn't respond the way the system expects. One person who looks at the same structure and sees something completely different. At first, it doesn't look like power. It looks like defiance, like misalignment, like someone who just doesn't fit. And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because the system knows how to absorb groups. It knows how to divide them, redirect them, weaken them until they become manageable again. But 1-1 is harder to predict, harder to contain. There's no collective behavior to study, no shared weakness to exploit, just a single variable that refuses to stabilize. That's where the shift begins, not in the outside world. Not immediately, but in perception. When one person stops accepting things as they are, it creates a contrast, a difference that can't be ignored once it's seen. Everyone else is moving in one direction, and then there's that one figure standing still, or worse. Moving the other way, it disrupts certainty. People start noticing the gap between what could be. They start questioning why they never saw it before. They start wondering if the rules they followed were ever as fixed as they believed. And all of that begins with one, not because that person is stronger, not because they're chosen, but because they crossed a line as existed the moment they refused existed. Within we lost squad and realize exist a moment movie for foreign where the views stay within it. Something invisible broke. The illusion of permanence. Because systems rely on belief as much as structure. They need people to believe that things cannot change, that resistance is pointless, that the way things are is the way they will always be. Remove that belief, even slightly, and everything becomes unstable. One person can do that. By acting differently, thinking differently, by refusing to mirror what everyone else has accepted without question. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be real. And reality has a way of spreading, not like noise, not like chaos, but like something quieter, something more persistent. People begin to see themselves in that one person, not completely, not all at once.